In this episode, we're going to focus on report on compliance, ROC, writing as a professional skill, because the fastest way to lose credibility in a PCI assessment is to produce a report that sounds confident but cannot be defended. New learners sometimes imagine that the technical testing is the hard part and the writing is the easy part. But in practice, the report is the artifact that other parties depend on. It is what examiners review, what stakeholders read, and what becomes the lasting record of what was validated. When examiners dislike a report, it is rarely because of one typo. It is usually because the report contains patterns that signal weak testing, unclear reasoning, or vague claims that cannot be verified. Those patterns are avoidable if you understand what a good ROC is meant to do. A good report tells a coherent, evidence-backed story about scope, testing, observations, and conclusions, using language that is specific enough to be meaningful but careful enough to be accurate. Avoiding the classic pitfalls is about building that story in a way that feels transparent and reliable rather than defensive, inflated, or confusing. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at Cyber.Author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. One of the most common pitfalls is vague language that sounds safe but actually weakens the report. Phrases like generally, typically, appears to, or in most cases are tempting because they let you avoid making a firm statement, but they also make the reader wonder what you actually tested. Examiners dislike vagueness because vagueness hides gaps. If something is generally true, what are the exceptions, and were those exceptions tested? If something appears to be configured correctly, what evidence demonstrates that it is configured correctly? A QSA report needs statements that tie to observable facts, like what you reviewed, what you observed, and what that observation implies for the requirement. This does not mean you must write in absolute terms when the evidence does not support absolutes. It means you should describe the scope of your testing and then make conclusions within that scope. For a beginner, the mindset is that clarity is not recklessness. Clarity is saying exactly what you did, exactly what you saw, and exactly how that supports the requirement, without hiding behind vague comfort words. Another classic pitfall is copying generic language that could fit any environment. Examiners dislike templated content that does not reflect the assessed organization because it suggests the report was written before the work was done. Generic language is especially damaging in scope and segmentation narratives. If the report describes a standard CDE boundary but does not match the organization's actual architecture, then the report becomes suspect, even if many controls are genuinely strong. A credible ROC includes environment-specific details that show the assessor understands the payment flow, the system roles, and the trust boundaries. Those details should be accurate and relevant, not a dump of internal information, but they should be specific enough that a reader can see the report is grounded in the real environment. Beginners often worry that specificity increases risk, but the correct approach is to be specific about what matters for controls while still avoiding unnecessary sensitive detail. Examiners want to see that the report is tailored to the environment rather than being a recycled document. A third pitfall is failing to connect evidence to the requirement in a traceable way. Sometimes reports include long descriptions of artifacts reviewed, like policies and screenshots, but never explain how those artifacts demonstrate the control. Examiners hate this because it looks like evidence theater, where the report lists a pile of things but does not build a clear chain of reasoning. A good ROC makes the logic visible. It explains what was tested, why that test is relevant, what evidence supports it, and what conclusion follows. If the control is about operational behavior, the report should reflect operational evidence, not only written intent. If the control is about configuration, the report should reflect configuration evidence and should describe the configuration in terms of the control objective. This is where beginners sometimes drift into summary mode, describing the environment rather than validating the requirement. The report must be a testing narrative, not an architecture brochure. Examiners want to see that the work is anchored to the standard and that the evidence directly supports the claim. Scope confusion is another classic pitfall, and it often shows up as inconsistent statements across different sections of the report. One section might describe a system as out of scope, while another section includes it in testing evidence. Or the report might treat a network as segmented without showing how segmentation was validated. Examiners dislike scope inconsistency because it undermines trust in every conclusion. In PCI work, scope is the frame around the entire assessment. If the frame is shaky, everything inside it becomes questionable. A strong report states the scope clearly, describes the CDE, explains data flows, and explains the basis for including or excluding systems. It also ensures that the same scope story is reflected consistently wherever the report discusses controls, sampling, and evidence. For beginners, the key is to remember that scope is not only a diagram. It is a set of defensible statements. Those statements must be aligned across the report, or else the report becomes internally contradictory. Examiners notice contradictions quickly, and contradictions are a signal of either poor understanding or poor documentation discipline. Another pitfall examiners dislike is overclaiming, where the report asserts stronger conclusions than the evidence supports. Overclaiming can happen when an assessor assumes controls are consistent across all systems based on a limited sample, or when the assessor treats vendor attestations as proof of the merchant's configurations, or when the assessor relies on verbal statements without operational records. Overclaiming is dangerous because it creates false confidence, which can lead organizations to postpone necessary improvements. It also damages the credibility of the assessment community. A better approach is to be precise about what was tested and what the conclusion applies to. If you sampled a set of systems, you can explain how the sample is representative and what population it covers. If you relied on a service provider, you can explain what evidence you reviewed and what responsibilities remain with the merchant. If you observed a process, you can explain what records support that observation. Examiners prefer a modest, well-supported claim over a broad, weakly supported claim. For beginners, the confidence habit is to let the evidence set the boundaries of your conclusion rather than letting optimism set those boundaries. The opposite pitfall is underexplaining, where the report states that something is compliant without providing enough description for a reader to understand why. This often happens when assessors assume the reader knows what they mean, or when they try to keep the report short by cutting context. Examiners dislike underexplaining because it forces them to guess what was tested, which increases review time and decreases confidence. A strong report provides enough context for each requirement, so the conclusion is understandable on its own. That context includes what systems were involved, what methods were used to test, and what evidence was reviewed. It should not become repetitive or bloated, but it must be complete enough that a reader can follow the logic without needing to ask basic questions. For beginners, the best approach is to imagine your report will be read by someone who is smart but unfamiliar with the specific environment. If your writing gives them the necessary context and ties it to evidence, you avoid the frustration that leads examiners to label a report as weak or unclear. Another classic pitfall is mixing consulting advice into the compliance narrative in a way that blurs the assessor's role. Examiners dislike reports that read like a set of recommendations rather than a validation record, because the purpose of the ROC is to document compliance status and testing results. That does not mean you cannot document observations, but observations must be presented in a way that supports compliance determinations. If the report includes long discussions of what the organization should do, it can distract from what the organization has demonstrated. It can also create confusion about whether an item is a requirement failure or a suggestion. A professional ROC distinguishes clearly between what was required, what was observed, and what conclusion was reached. If something is not met, the report should state it plainly and describe the gap. If something is met, the report should state it and support it. Beginners sometimes feel pressure to soften findings by turning them into friendly advice, but examiners prefer clear determinations with clear evidence. Clarity is fairer to the organization because it avoids ambiguous statements that can be interpreted in conflicting ways later. Inconsistent terminology is another pitfall that examiners dislike because it creates confusion and can hide scope and control inconsistencies. If the report uses different names for the same system, or uses a term like payment server in one place and application cluster in another without clarifying they are the same, the reader will struggle to follow. This is especially harmful in modern environments where services are numerous and names are similar. A good report uses consistent naming and defines key terms early. It also maintains consistent use of acronyms and expands them appropriately the first time. Beginners often underestimate how much confusion small naming inconsistencies can create. Examiners interpret confusion as risk because it suggests the assessor may not have a stable mental model of the environment. Consistency in language is a form of evidence that the work was organized and grounded. When the report reads smoothly and names match across sections, it becomes easier for examiners to trust the conclusions. Poor handling of compensating control narratives is another area where examiners become skeptical quickly. A compensating control is not a creative workaround. It is a structured argument that an alternative control meets the intent of the requirement at least as well as the original control. Examiners dislike compensating control write-ups that are vague, that do not address the requirement's intent, or that do not explain why the alternative is sufficient. Even when compensating controls are legitimate, weak write-ups make them look suspicious. A strong compensating control narrative explains the constraint that prevents meeting the original requirement, the risks that constraint introduces, the alternative controls implemented, and how those controls achieve the same or better outcome. It also includes evidence that the compensating control is operating and is maintained. Beginners sometimes treat compensating controls as a shortcut, but in assessment work, they demand more discipline, not less, because the argument must be precise. Examiners prefer straightforward compliance when possible, but when compensating controls are used, they expect a clear, evidence-backed justification. As we close, remember that the classic ROC writing pitfalls examiners dislike are not mysterious traps. They are patterns that signal weak testing, weak traceability, or weak clarity. Avoiding them means writing with specific, evidence-tied language instead of vague comfort phrasing, tailoring descriptions to the real environment rather than copying generic templates, and maintaining a consistent, defensible scope story throughout the report. It also means letting evidence set the boundaries of your conclusions, explaining enough context for each requirement to be understood, and keeping the report focused on validation rather than drifting into consulting advice. Clear terminology, disciplined handling of compensating controls, and organized traceability all reinforce credibility. A QSA who writes this way makes the examiner's job easier because the report tells a coherent story that can be followed without guesswork, and that is what examiners ultimately want. When you build your writing around transparency and traceability, you do not just avoid examiner frustration. You produce a report that serves the payment ecosystem by being trustworthy, fair, and useful.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.